for me in terms of, without ever being too harsh on ourselves, to say, what other people who have been through the worst of the worst are able to find in terms of meaning in life and finding hope and really thinking about, I've just had so much luck and privilege in my life, and to be able to use that to try to better the conditions of humanity, I see as not just a responsibility, but a privilege.
So shifting gears a little bit, we're here at the Harris School of Public Policy, and we have hundreds of classmates who are going to go out into the world after graduation, some of whom have already worked in policy, but definitely will work in organizations, many of them in development, let's say, or NGOs. What are 2 or 3 things your experience has taught you about working within organizations like NGOs and government? I know you've also had experience there. And what type of advice would you give to those students?
So the first will be extremely boring, which is that management and bureaucracy can be your friend. Okay. Because I did a PhD in anthropology, so I got an intensive interaction with a variety of academics. And I think it's always wonderful to have time to be, free to think and write and reflect. I will say, having worked in larger organizations that, you can do so much. You, with the leverage and power of a team and a bureaucracy behind you, that is change and opportunity at scale. And there is no brilliant idea out there that is adopted just because it's great and brilliant. There is so much blood, sweat, and tears that goes into getting it adopted and scaled and adapted. So I think make that investment. It is hard. I still, every year when it comes time to do annual performance reviews, I think, oh my gosh, I don't have time to do this. But ultimately, those are the resources that I have to affect change in the world. So that is one thing that I've learned. And I would say it's probably not my natural tendency. So it's one that I've had to work on. The second is that it's the world out there is big, but actually this community and the community that you will work in probably is relatively small. And the golden rule, when I first went to the State Department, I saw how some people came in, maybe they're political appointees for the first time, and they were just a little bit too big for their britches, and I said, oh, well, that's going to be the same person. That desk officer you weren't nice to, is going to be your boss, or, you're going to interact with them at some important meeting. And I know it sounds pretty basic, but really going in with that spirit that we're in a community that is trying to work together, is really important. And then the third piece, which is linked to the first two, is, as you move up in the world, and I know Harris School students and anyone else listening will move up in the world, how can you also create space to go back to first principles? So, I came into all of this as an anthropologist really believing that refugees, other affected populations have to be at the heart of what we do. That becomes harder as you move up because there are a lot more meetings so that you can get to scale and have bigger influence. But how do you maintain that connection? And also it's just good for the soul because you're being reminded of why you wanted to embark on this journey in the first place.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And in line with that, management and bureaucracy and administration are often things that are underlooked. Policy research and analysis is a little more fancy and attractive. But when you look at the vast landscape of humanitarian and aid organizations doing good work to alleviate poverty and suffering around the world, what are some things that you think the industry as a whole could be doing better? Is it greater transparency? Is it more evidence-based approaches? Is it are there any kind of structural or systemic issues that you think they could improve on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that just there is, I think in the basket of just do no harm and do basic right by people. I think there's a lot more work that could be done. We've seen a number of cases where, NGOs haven't done just the basics to make sure that it's a safe workplace or that beneficiaries aren't exploited or abused in some way. So I think that is and that is about linked to a broader issue of transparency and accountability. And I do think it's easy, again, to put off some of those issues as less about the core policy, new idea, or programs. But, we've seen some organizations really, it becomes an existential threat to doing your work if you lose your credibility. So I think that's one area that's really important. Another area is, after development, we've tried to grapple with this, but I think we still have a long way to go, which is just really, saying the serenity prayer and saying, we outside NGO government, we cannot drive or really do development in a country. It really is about the people living in that country. And it's really hard to hold on to that humility because there are big problems and there are, ways that we can help. So I think kind of having that, there's a lot of great both rhetoric and starting to be some practice around what does it mean to include these populations in the design and execution of projects? What does it mean to really work more closely with governments while still holding them accountable when they are perpetrators of injustice? So I think that's another big area of work. And finally, just because it's one that's really close to my heart, is around bridging what I referenced, before in terms of there being a divide between different sectors, humanitarian and development, or, you can look across any number of sectors of really siloed approaches, and just coming back to that reality that people are whole people who live in communities. So while we know we need different kinds of technical expertise, what can we do to have a more holistic picture of where indicators can be improved, and also including people in the process of setting those indicators?
So it's a difficult question, but to the point of systemic issues in aid, you recently penned an opinion piece along with a couple of other authors in the Oregonian about the sexual scandal involving the founder of Mercy Corps, Ellsworth Culver. And in it, you and your co-authors posit that the rash of abuse scandals in the development community is actually symptomatic of a broader issue and not simply one-offs. So I feel like I'd be remiss after what you just said if I didn't ask you about that and what you think the future is in the industry and where you think the fixes are.
Yeah, I do stand by what we wrote in terms of it. I think it's often too easy to say, oh, well, that was just one bad apple. Oh, okay, well, we didn't catch it that time, but now we have this gold standard policy in place. I think, then this is not, it is about the development community, but it goes much broader. And we see this in the Me Too movement. And, we are working against thousands plus years of patriarchy. So it's going to be a long journey, and we should accept that. And, take from that there's really nothing can be too much in terms of paying attention to these issues and the investments that we need to make. So I think as with all systemic change issues, we need both the policy change and then we need culture change. And I think we're at a place now where a lot of organizations, partly in response to the scandals at Mercy Corps and Oxfam and Save the Children, they do have the gold standard policies. So I do feel we're now at a point where it's really about how do we set a tone and a set of values to start changing the culture, and make sure that leadership is resourcing those. We need independent audit functions, independent reporting. We need that to become part of the system. And to what does that speak to in the broader picture? I think, in addition to just the general power dynamics across the world, I also think we have to be very attentive to the specific power dynamics when it comes to development development and humanitarian programs, which is that we are talking about extremely vulnerable people, in the case of refugees, who have fled their country out of absolute necessity, who don't have their belongings, whose family members have been targeted and killed. So, I mean, what do we take into that? We have to understand that good intentions are not enough. Those power dynamics are there, and we do need safeguarding. We need systems in place to mitigate the harm, intentional or unintentional, that can be done in those situations.
I want to close with two kind of quick-fire questions.
Yeah.
So first, how does your background, you said you had a PhD in cultural anthropology. How does your background shape your approach to policy research and implementing interventions?
Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I also did do a master's in public policy.
Yes, at Princeton, at the Woodrow Wilson School. Yes, we did
also
our research.
Also an excellent school.
Yeah.
Alongside Harris. So
that was the right answer.
Yeah. So how that affects my approach, and you may have heard it in some of my responses, is that, we have to put people at the center. And that is, and anthropology, I think, still has among the most trenchant critiques of why development programs don't work, because there was a cultural insight or a power dynamic that, really put things off kilter. And I will say that's great. And we're asking tough questions. And now, like, the charge to the next generation is, how do we do that in a way that also allows us to make the maximum contribution we can to supporting people in their journeys of development?
Okay, and the final question is about refugee camps. Having visited refugee camps yourself and seen the conditions that people live in there, do you think that they're a necessary evil or something we can realistically work to make obsolete in the near future?
I think in the near future, it will still be a mix. And I think that does get to the point of what are the tailored solutions that are needed. So there is evidence that shows that, for some groups of people, camps are really helpful because housing costs are too high elsewhere and they're not able to work. And so I think what I would love to see is not the camps where we have generations of people growing up without opportunities, but camps as part of a safety net system, where it does make sense for certain vulnerable populations, but that are really a launching pad and for new and better opportunities now and in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cindy Huang.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Dr. Cindy Huang. Special thanks to Ning Wong for engineering this episode and Aishwarya Raje for editing. Your interviewers were Sonnet, Frisbie, and Mwangi, Thuita. We'd like to thank UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter